Okay, so welcome everybody. I am Dr. Lord Antonio, and I'm a professor of international business at the George Washington University School of Business. And before we get started, just a few technical details. In addition to being recorded, if you do have a question as we go along, I think the easiest strategy is to have you type that in the chat. And I'm hopeful we'll have time for questions at the end of the session. If you're one of my students and you're in this panelist room where we can see and hear you, just please make sure that you remain muted. So anyway, I'm excited to have everyone join me today for a discussion. This is our class, by the way. This is our Global Value Chains class, but we're having a discussion today with Patrick McGee, who's the author of Apple in China. This is my shameless plug for Patrick's
A lot of
book.
notes. I like that.
I was going to say you can see all the little notes that I was making when I was reading it. And if you haven't read it, you really should. So Patrick McGee, welcome.
Thank you.
So as a professor in a business school, we talk about Apple a lot. It's used as an example in textbooks. I checked Harvard Business Publishing, and there are 272 cases published about Apple. There are books, there's a lot out there about Apple. I think 80% of my students have iPhones. I don't. I might add that I have not drunk the Apple Kool-Aid. But in other words, there's lots of info on Apple, but your book had a really interesting and different focus, and I learned a lot. So I really commend you for that. And maybe we start there. So your book details Apple's manufacturing story, which is as innovative in many ways as it's much more reported on design story and business model story. And so, maybe we can start there with Apple originally as a manufacturer. They were actually a little behind their competition in getting to contract manufacturing. So maybe take us from their in-house production in the 1980s or so to maybe Taiwan when they're really starting that, as you call it, long march to China.
Yeah, this answer could be different in so many ways. So let me see. I mean, I guess just to give the most basic history of Apple, right? It's founded by two guys named Steve in a garage, and the electronic supply chain doesn't exist at the time. The PC barely exists. I mean, some of you might know the first Apple computer is called the Apple I, and it's literally just a circuit board. Bring your own monitor, bring your own keyboard. And a mouse didn't even exist, so you couldn't bring that, right? That's how early Apple is. So in the sort of controlling DNA of the company, if you can kind of think of Steve Jobs as being maniacal about all kinds of details, of course, they were going to build their own computer. They had to, otherwise they didn't feel like they could ensure the quality. And the idea of someone else building the computer, i.e. contract manufacturing, it doesn't really exist at the time. And so this company called Spacecraft Incorporated, you could think of as the Foxconn of its day. I give them a bunch of ink in the early chapters because they have this fascinating founding story that I won't go into, but it comes out of Alabama. And in 1981, for the IBM PC, IBM basically goes after SCI and understands that they could build a circuit board not by hand, but in an automated way. And that partnership becomes so successful that eventually IBM just has SCI do the whole thing, assemble the components and put it all together and then badge it IBM. And that becomes extremely influential and gives rise to the likes of Dell, Compaq, HP, Gateway, who all adopt this model. And they kind of wipe the floor with Apple, as it were. So Apple's still trying to do things in-house, but the financials, the speed, even the quality is all much better if you're relying on contract manufacturers. And you know, there's a technology transfer inherent to relying on someone else building your computer. If you're not building it, you're missing out on what Andy Grove would later call shop floor innovation, right? How do we build it better and so forth? And so what's interesting to me is there's a transfer of knowledge that goes from company to company. So think of IBM to SCI in the early years of the 80s and 90s. But then the suppliers themselves, the contract manufacturers themselves, they're in fierce competition with one another. to win more orders from the 5 or 6 PC companies I just mentioned. And so they're the ones that start going over to Taiwan in particular, Japan in particular, to win those orders, right, to save on costs. And then later on, they're the ones who choose China as the place to go because of the ubiquity of labor, the hardworkingness of the labor, and so forth. And so for me, looking at the geopolitics of this, what's fascinating about that is the technology transfer is no longer going from company to company, it's going from country to country. And in some ways, this is fantastic, right? This is what Pax Americana is built on. The idea that after World War II, America was actually going to help its fierce rivals that they were literally just, killing a few months before, right? So America plays this starring role, sort of taking Japan into a modern democracy, and it plays something a similar role for West Germany, for Korea, and for Taiwan. And when the Taiwanese become really, really good at building computers in the late 80s and early 90s, there's like a rapprochement between Taiwan and China. And of course, they'd been in civil war. And that's sort of the founding of modern Taiwan, is the losing side of the civil war flees to Taiwan. And so these businessmen known as the Taisheng, these entrepreneurs, they end up going to mainland China to really take advantage of the seemingly unending supply of labor. So this is, in a sense, I'm obviously simplifying quite a bit here, is why Apple is nearly dead in 1996. The supply chain has just completely outclassed Apple. And what Steve Jobs realizes when he gets the attempt to come back to Apple, and it's worth knowing, he comes back to be CEO for the first time. He had never been CEO before. He founded the company, but he hadn't been the CEO. So he comes back in early 1997. He originally does not want the role of CEO that he's offered, but he and Johnny Ive eventually come to realize that as much as the other side in the PC world has this supply chain dominance, the computer is becoming more personal. I'm just thinking of my computer here. My kitchen is right there, right? I'm not sort of cramped down in a basement. And that was what was beginning to happen. And so they were looking at the aesthetics of things that you would find in your kitchen and realizing we can bring that to the computer. We can redefine what a computer looks like. And they're sort of anticipating Moore's Law is going to take you towards having products in your pocket, iPod, obviously, iPhone, and that you're going to want that thing to be aesthetically pleasing. And so for all the supply chain dominance of everyone that was using Windows and Intel, there was this like entry point for them to redefine what a computer looked like, where it would be in your home, how simple it would be to use, etc. And because the dawn of the internet was really just happening. I mean, at this stage, we're just beginning to have cable internet. And so there's this real opportunity for them to rethink what a computer is. But the problem, of course, is Apple is so desperate at this point that they really have no money. And the idea that they're going to build the computer itself is themselves is a total non-starter. And so they end up going to their analog monitor provider, which is LG in Korea. And then we're kind of off to the races. And there ends up being this 7-year narrative where they haven't quite found China, as it were, and their computers actually being built on 3 continents in 8 or 9 countries. And then I'll pass it back to Laura here, but eventually China sort of wins out as the place to consolidate everything. But it happens sort of slowly and then suddenly.
Okay, so that covered a lot of territory. So let's jump straight to Taiwan and the Taisheng, because I felt like the Apple story in your book is very much the Foxconn story.
Yeah.
And much as we've got Steve Jobs being the charismatic leader, and then Tim Cook being the not so charismatic, but his own unique operational self. But the Terry Go, charismatic leader behind Foxconn, is a super important story. So maybe tell us a little bit about the Foxconn Apple relationship and how that has evolved over time.
So first, let me just say about Terry Guo. I mean, he really is like the Henry Ford of Asia. Ridiculously important figure. James Fallows once said in The Atlantic that if you look at Shenzhen, which in a matter of a generation goes from a series of fishing villages to a city of more than 10 million people, I believe we're around 18 or 19 million people today. The first person most responsible for that change is Deng Xiaoping, the paramount leader of China that adopts the reform and opening up policies. And number 2 would be Terry Guo. That's a fundamental thing to understand, just that these Taiwanese entrepreneurs, but Terry and Foxconn in particular, play this massive role industrializing China. And I guess it's just worth knowing. I mean, in the 80s and 90s, even in the early 2000s, made in China is synonymous with bad quality. Um, you don't just sort of uh, you know, build build things in good quality just because you want to. You need to be trained. And that is what Terry understands. So Terry understands that Apple will negotiate the hell out of a deal and that you really won't get paid very much doing it. And that what it's asking of you is so much more challenging than what Dell or HP or anyone else is asking of you. And whereas most people see those demands and say, why would I want to work with Apple? He basically looks at it and says, the challenge is exactly why I want to work with Apple. The challenge is the opportunity. Because if my team can please Apple, we can please any client, right? And so Terry's actually really clever and he sort of plays this against Apple. So Apple will literally send in engineers to train up Terry's team. And then one day the engineers will go in, the Apple engineers, and find that they don't recognize a single face on the production line. And it's because Terry has cleverly taken the people that have received 3 or 4 months of Apple training and then put them on the Dell line, right, to improve the quality of Dell computers. And it's like a new semester had started, a new cohort of people working for Foxconn ready and willing to receive Apple's lessons. So in short form, Terry is the first person to understand that the value of working with Apple is not the profits, it's something more intangible, it's the learning.
So initially, it seems like Foxconn tries to move up from just being a part supplier and then they're the assembly point, and they try to do some management of lower tier suppliers. But then it seems like later in the book, I was kind of confused about this, so I'm hoping you can clarify. Later in the book, it seems like Apple takes back its control of its lower tier suppliers because
Mm.
the tier one suppliers are kind of exploiting the lower tier suppliers or not having the correct products and things like that from the lower tier suppliers. So initially, this is kind of a way for Foxconn to capture more value, but then later on, Apple is like, no, no, we want control of
Yeah.
much of our supply
You're
chain.
an astute reader. Now, this is exactly what happened. So essentially, I compare Foxconn's low margin assembly to Costco selling hot dogs, where they're probably losing money on each hot dog, but it's a way to bring people in the door. And so Foxconn is no more enamored of low value final assembly test and pack out than anybody else. But they realize that if you do that well, you can sort of take on adjacent tasks. So you can end up sort of sourcing your own components. And in Foxconn's case, they would often have subdivisions that would be the sourcer of those components. So Terry would have this like 10-layer model of sort of how to vertically integrate and take control. And so one of the sort of secrets of Foxconn is something called PPV, or purchase price variance. And so what that would be saying we're buying 10,000 whatever kind of components at $1 each. But actually, the price they pay is maybe 70 cents. And they charge Apple $1, but they pay 70 cents. And the margin that they make, that 30% difference, ends up being how they make money. So they get paid very little for the assembly, but they make money by sourcing their own components and indeed building their own components. What happens is that that's a great entry point for Apple, right? To be able to have more and more taken on by Foxconn, and for all sorts of low level components, that continues to be the case. I believe even today. I mean, Foxconn has all kinds of divisions, but around 2010, when the iPhone is just becoming absolutely wild in significance. I mean, they go from 5 million in 2007 to 230 million by 2015. So I don't remember the exact figure, but they're in the tens of millions by 2010. And Foxconn is sort of trying to exert its control at this stage. Whether that means using their leverage in negotiation or trying to take on more parts or maybe substituting the parts that Apple has authorized with cheaper components, things like that. And Apple realizes that with the quality levels that they demand, they can't rely on Foxconn or really any other supplier to just go get the raw materials and have them ready when necessary. In other words, in a global supply chain, if one part doesn't work for whatever you're building, the whole thing can't ship, right? And so Apple needs to take control. And so they end up disintermediating Foxconn, sort of quoting somebody here, a source. and they end up taking greater control. So they end up doing the procurement negotiations themselves. So instead of relying on Foxconn to do that thing where they got the extra margin through purchase price variance, Apple does it itself. And it's kind of for two reasons. One, it's a power move where Apple believes we're better negotiators than anybody else, so we're going to get the best deal. But two, if they're sort of owning the contracts in that way, they have more authority to make sure that everything is going to come. So they're not just sort of trusting their suppliers, they're in direct partnership with them. And so that's how they end up sort of taking far, far greater control than anybody else because they're not just working with a Foxconn, they're working 4 levels deep in the supply chain.
Yeah, so you mentioned Foxconn's margins and that Foxconn is using this PPV strategy to boost their margins. But the contrast between Apple's margins, which are increasing and far exceed the industry standard,
Yes.
and Foxconn's margins, which are decreasing despite huge volumes. Touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I've almost wondered if I should do a little supply chain study of, let's say, 30 different Apple suppliers using some clever Excel work, and then try to coin, sorry, some equivalent of Moore's law, where the more closely, the more intimately you work with Apple, the lower your margins will be. Because from all the suppliers I've looked at, that's absolutely true. And I even have funny instances where Apple once found a supplier. I won't go into the details, but they were earning more margin than Apple. And this is like deep into the iPhone era. And Apple was like basically offended by this. And so they ended up taking the skill sets that they knew that this other team had, and they ended up training its rivals, right, to increase competition and sort of dampen the margins of this company. So Apple's a pretty ruthless company in many respects. And some of my favorite chapters are actually about the Blevinator, this sort of procurement chief who when people would defend him, they would say, you know, he might be a sociopath or a shark, but what you have to understand is that the only companies that existed 20 years ago that continued to exist are sociopaths and sharks, or they don't exist. The idea being that this game is so difficult and competitive that if you don't act like that, you went bankrupt more than 10 years ago. Sorry, I went off on a wild tangent there. You have to actually remind me of what the question was because I know I had an answer, but I
Okay.
decided to go off on the tangent.
All right, so the question was, the PPV thing doesn't solve Foxconn's question.
Oh, margins. You wanted to ask about margins.
Margins,
Yes.
yeah.
One thing that blew my mind, and I actually thought that maybe I was inputting the currency incorrectly or something, was that in the first 4 years of the Apple Foxconn partnership, so the first 4 years of this century, Foxconn had higher margins than Apple, and Foxconn made more money in profits, which is kind of wild. And my little thought experiment is that if you were hired as Xi Jinping's lawyer in early 2013 to make the case against Apple, basically to make the case that it's a foreign company that's exploiting the country. Public data would serve you all kinds of things because you'd have a really good case against Apple. And the first thing that you would show is that Apple and Foxconn sort of get together at a time when Foxconn has 10% margins. Apple literally has 1% margins. And then on the success of them together building the iPod Mini, the iPod Nano, the iPhone, and then the iPhone going global, Foxconn's margins collapse to about 2.5%. So they go down by about 3/4, even as their revenues soar. And Apple margins go from 1% to 26%. So both companies have soaring revenues, but only Apple is really getting huge profits out of this. And of course, from any sort of outsider perspective, that looks like Apple is indeed a very exploitative company. And the next sort of part of the book, which is really where the thesis comes in after just like lots of fun stories, sort of globetrotting the world, is what I was talking about earlier, where Apple has to explain to Chinese officials, really at the highest levels. I mean, this is literally Tim Cook going to Zhongnanhai, the sort of equivalent of the White House, and explaining that it's true, lots of suppliers do not make much money from us. But you've got to understand, it's because we are training factories, 1,600 factories, state-of-the-art engineering, and letting them thrive on their own. And so it goes back to the whole thing that Terry understood, that the value of working with Apple is not the money, it's the learning. And so this is sort of where I argue that Apple becomes, however inadvertently, the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025, which is a big policy from a decade ago where China wants to sever its dependence on the West. It wants to be as self-sufficient as possible. And irony of ironies, the best way to do that, if you're a supplier, is work with the mother of all capitalist companies, Apple.
Yeah, so that's that there are lots of questions I have about this, but so Apple expects an enormous amount from their suppliers, and there's a certain amount of risk in being an Apple supplier, right? I mean, you
Huge.
might invest in this whole production line, set up this process for making a prototype, and then Apple goes someplace else, or they install their machinery in your factory, and then they get mad at you and they pull it out and take it to your competitor next door.
Yes,
Um,
that's a Foxconn story that you're quoting,
yeah,
right? And that's
yeah,
in
yeah,
broad daylight. This was
yeah.
described as a giant middle finger to Foxconn. Like mid-negotiation, a bunch of engineers just go over and start unmounting the machinery that they've installed in Foxconn, just as a way of saying, like, we own this. We can move our production anywhere we'd like, anytime we'd like.
Well, let's go back to that. So let's about the machinery that Apple installs in the factories of its suppliers, because I think this is incredibly intriguing. So while it's trying to have a kind of asset light contract manufacturing model, it owns billions of dollars worth of equipment that it purchases and puts in the factories of its suppliers, but it retains ownership of that. I think that's
Yes.
really fascinating.
Yeah, so my comparison is that Apple sort of masters manufacturing in the same way that Uber is the largest provider of taxis in the world but doesn't own any cars, or Airbnb is the largest hotel provider in the world without owning any hotel rooms. So this is, it's funny, it's not entirely clear how much strategy was behind this. And I say that because, in part, Apple just didn't have the money to open factories. And so they were sort of operating under the radar. And I don't think Beijing had much understanding of what they were doing in Shenzhen. After all, Shenzhen in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was a special economic zone where the national laws didn't really apply. Right? I mean, across China, you can't even open a business. They're literally not legal until 1988. But Shenzhen has this sort of 10-year head start where they're open to capitalist experimentation. And so, in a certain sense, the first years of Apple operating in China aren't really even in China. Geographically, of course, they're in China, but on a sort of legal basis, they're operating out of a special zone that is distinct from the rest of the country. Um, Once again, I've gone off on a tangent, and so sorry. Take me
Okay,
back.
give me some scale of this massive amount of equipment that
Oh
Apple
yeah, buying
is,
equipment for their
yeah,
own.
buying equipment, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting. It's just that, like, in order to meet Apple's quality levels, Apple has to do the investment. Sometimes they even operate as a bank and give loans to companies, but sometimes they just own the machinery, they tag it as for Apple use only, and they install it in these factories. And it's just because they require all sorts of special machinery to get things done. And if the companies can't afford it, but they have a certain hunger and competence and diligence, then Apple will install it in those factories and then just sort of take control. The best example of this is when Apple introduced a MacBook that internally they called the unibody MacBook. So instead of welding different parts of metal together to create a laptop chassis, they use a CNC machine to sort of think of the way that Michelangelo carved David, right? You start with a block of marble and then you sort of find David within it by carving all around it. That's essentially what they did for a laptop. And they did this using a CNC machine. Um, and CNC machines are nothing new. This wasn't some novel technology. They go back decades, but they cost upwards of 500,000 or even $1 million each. And so companies only use them to prototype a product, and then you would find some more efficient way to build it. But Johnny Ive and Steve Jobs have this idea of, why don't we just buy 10,000 of these machines, install them on factory floors that aren't ours, and mass produce laptops. And that's what they do. And that's it's a presentation in 2008 that Steve Jobs, for the first time, sort of gives a nod publicly to Apple's operational excellence, and in particular to a unit called MD, or manufacturing design. And it's sort of it's a stunning example of Apple taking control of its supply chain, but it's also a stunning example of how everything ends up being done in China, because who's going to operate the CNC machines and understand how they work and what happens when they're broken, etc. It's going to be everyone that's in China, but they're going to do so at the behest of Apple training them all. And then within a few years, Apple suppliers are wanting to win those orders. So they're finding ways to get state subsidies and stuff and start purchasing thousands of CNC machines themselves. But frankly, only once they're available. Apple is purchasing so many CNC machines at the time that they're literally buying the entire pipeline of a company called Fanuc, and then scouring the globe to purchase even more. And so their operational edge is absolutely extreme, and yet nobody was really familiar with it because, I think we in the journalism world were basically failing to cover them as an operational company, which is doubly fascinating if you consider that these are the years in which Steve Jobs died, and who becomes CEO is their operational guy. So, there were some pretty big hints in 2011 that Apple was becoming an operational company, and we failed to notice it almost entirely.
So let's go back to Foxconn for a minute. I think it's important for students and everybody else to grasp the size and scope of some of these companies, some of these factories, just in terms of numbers of employees. And this ties into your earlier comment about China's flexible labor force. I
Mhm.
was reading just recently that in The Economist that China has 40 million workers in the gig manufacturing economy, just that can kind of be shipped from factory to factory. And Foxconn has enormous turnover in these factories, shocking levels of turnover.
Yes.
And turnover from a management perspective, you don't want turnover. Turnover is bad. Turnover hurts your margins. And they are turning over 25% of like a million employees at a time. It's astonishing.
Yeah, no, Chinese factories can often have churn of north of 300% in a year. And what that means is you're rotating your entire workforce multiple times per year. So, I was able to get some internal documents about this. So just for one instance, this is a Pegatron factory. It's a competitor to Foxconn in the Pudong district of Shanghai. And they had 100,000 people assembling Apple products in any given month. But the problem was they were losing 25,000 people a month, which meant they had to hire 25,000 people a month. And so when people ask me, like, why can't we bring iPhone manufacturing to America? Like, among the 20 reasons why, that's why. Because find me a city where you have anything close to that sort of churn. But one thing I would sort of take issue with is the idea that this is a problem for Apple. It is partly a problem. I mean, they can always hire people at the Foxconn factories, but retaining them is an issue. But you also don't want to retain them. Right. In some instances, of course you do, but in other instances, Apple production, if you look at sort of a production map, it's spiky, right? It spikes around now, right? Just before the Christmas season after an iPhone is launched, but then it really falls back in February or March. So you don't want a bunch of people that are on your payroll that you're paying to sort of twiddle their thumbs all day. So you want that churn. You frankly want people that are only going to be in Shenzhen for maybe 4 months, and then they move on to some other factory, or maybe they stay in Shenzhen, but they're just going to another factory. And so that very much is the sort of secret sauce of what Apple is able to discover in China, that the labor isn't just cheap, it's flexible. And instead of having it on your own balance sheet, it's on someone else's balance sheet. But even for Foxconn, they don't have to have these people on their permanent staff. They're temporary workers. And this is another thing that China seemingly didn't like about Apple. And so they passed this law in 2014, basically saying, like, thou shalt not have more than 10% of your workers be temporary workers. And Apple has to perform its own supply chain study to realize that often 80% of the workers for peak iPhone season are temporary workers. And I think in something like half of their factories, more than 50% of the workers were temp workers. And the brilliance of the Gang of Eight, this is a team of senior people that come on board to sort of help placate local officials, is to realize that this law isn't really a law in the Western sense. It's not rule of law, it's rule by law. And essentially, what China is introducing is a law that they know the likes of Apple won't be able to adhere to. And so, in order for the law not to apply to you, you engage in wink wink arrangements with the local mayor. So, a law is established at a federal level, but it's enforced locally. And Apple learns to play the game with the local cadres to basically be exempt from the law by performing certain favors for them and sort of deriving certain factory growth. So I'm jumping ahead in the narrative a little bit, but capitalism and the state, indeed the party, are very interlinked in China, and this is something Apple has to learn from 2013 to the present.
So they may figure out ways around being exempt from local law, but the Apple's not exempt from global scrutiny of its supply chain. And so I want to touch a little bit on how they handle things like labor violations. We talk in our course about supply chain governance, and Apple's efforts to govern the supply chain via traditional methods like audits and things like that are not super successful.
No, there's a couple of things to give there. One answer would just be that Apple had a tendency of having reporters do some digging into their supply chain, and basically, invariably, they find people are working well beyond the 60-hour minimums, or sorry, maximums, I should say. Maybe 100 people housed to a room with cold water as showers and all sorts of stuff that would make Apple look bad. And then Apple would do what any Western corporation would do, which is like make some real pledges to take more control and introduce more oversight into these things. And them playing the role of white knight had this unexpected reading in Beijing where, like, wait a minute, basically what you're saying is that without Apple sort of like introducing all these mechanisms for control, factory workers would just be living in these miserable conditions. And if you're a socialist country, like that's a pretty bad message. Like it's not a socialist country and you need to be saved by this Western company. And so it actually sort of creates problems for them because it looks like they're saying something negative about working in China. So that's one part of the answer. The other is that I have this sort of mini tragedy within the book. Someone who led supplier responsibility after a bunch of Foxconn workers had jumped from the roof of Foxconn to their deaths in 2010, 2011, and there were accusations of what was called eye slavery. And this woman who'd worked with Tim Cook going back to the 80s at 3 different companies named Jackie Haynes really comes on board, and she considers suppliers her clients. She's a real advocate for them. And I say it's a mini tragedy because in her 5-year effort to really give back to Foxconn and other workers. She's really unable to do so because of the twin problems of Xi Jinping's tightening grip on the country, where they don't want people marching, even pronouncing Marxist slogans about workers' rights. That's not going to play well in Xi Jinping's China. And Apple's operational demands are just so difficult on these companies that when the companies have to choose between pleasing Apple and, minimizing overtime, invariably they will choose pleasing Apple. And so she's like a sort of heroic figure, but a tragic heroic figure because she's not really able to have great success. And eventually she's just sort of taken away from her job entirely. And lots of people that I knew who worked with her in the supply chain or even at Apple sort of don't know what happened to her. She's just sort of taken on projects that don't involve the very thing that she was brought back out of retirement to do.
Mm. And so I want to move a little bit now from the production side of things to the distribution and sales and servicing side of things.
Perfect, because I see John Ford there, and I would love to introduce him.
Yes, so I'm excited about that too. But let me just say, by way of background, that since my course is a value chain course, that includes the whole value chain, including the distribution and sales and after service part of value creation. And the Apple story of distribution and sales and service is just fascinating. The Apple in China sales and distribution mess is unbelievable. Great story. And the person who led it is with us. So, John, welcome.
Hi, Lauren. Nice to meet you.
Yes, and you. Thank you for being here.
Happy to.
I'm going to let you guys interact here.
Well,
Sure
I
thing.
guess I would just introduce John Ford as this Mandarin-speaking former missionary to Taiwan, who then ends up leading a retail store. Gosh, I wrote this book, so I should really know this. I think in Denver is where you ended up, right?
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
correct. Okay, good. And then when Apple's going to open its first store in China, it's at a time when Apple doesn't really believe there's a future market in China, but the Beijing Olympics are going to take place, and they're basically offered this, plot of real estate at the Sanlitun sort of higher end mall where their neighbors end up being, I think, the likes of Nike and Burberry and whatnot. And so they end up opening this store, and John is the guy sent over to lead it. And then his narrative of what happens next is just absolutely wild. So I would just say, take it away, John.
Yeah, I got there at an interesting time. So if you go back to 2003 when I joined Apple, Apple was kind of just starting to emerge as a recovering company. Ended up in the 90s, most of my career was doing exactly what you mentioned a moment ago. I was actually a supply chain auditor. I would go out and look at factories looking for child labor. So most of my 90s was spent traveling throughout China, working with the early onset groups right after Kathleen Gifford had a big issue with the child labor in the mid 90s. And then when I joined Apple, it was like I'd been a Mac user my whole life, so it was like coming home for me. And a few years just working in different parts of the business, and suddenly one day they're talking about opening this store in China, and I literally volunteered to go help, assuming I'd be a door greeter or something. Like, hey, they can just use me somehow to speak Chinese to people. It might be funny for them. And 2 weeks later, I realized they didn't have a plan on what they were going to do. And for the students on the call, like you think these big companies have plans for everything, and this was a moment that shocked me when I got brought into a room and they said, "Look, we know where we're going to build the store. We know what it's going to look like. We don't know anything else. We need a business license. We need tax trade. We need currency. We need a ton of stuff set up. And you have this entrepreneurial background from your time when you were in your 20s." And so we think that plus your Chinese language might be interesting. And I told this to Ron Johnson. I told this to Patrick too. If they had any idea how big China would have become, it would not have been, I wouldn't have been the answer to their problems. It would have been an army of people going to figure out the retail business. They really saw it as something kind of, interesting, one store around the Olympics. Maybe we do two or three and see how it goes. There was a lot of pessimism. I think Steve had told Ron right after Ron told me that we were going into China. It was kind of a foolish idea. We're not in multiple places across Europe. We're not in some of our biggest markets around the world yet. We're going to go launch in China where we barely sell anything. If you take the iPod out of it, Apple sales were almost non-measurable. And so it was an interesting time to be going to China and then taking a highly cultured company. So from a retail perspective, although operations was very rigid in how they did things in Apple, retail was run by emotion, culture, people, trying to do the best thing for our customers. And so the way that we lived our lives was a little bit different than the team who was in grinding, building the products. And so trying to bring that culture to China and not have it become something dramatically different was quite a challenge. And I will say today, I'm pretty proud of the fact that if you go into an Apple store in China, it'll feel like any Apple store anywhere in the world, other than the fact that they're speaking Chinese. So that was kind of my early on journey stepping into, I think you told the story really, really well in the chapter where you kind of highlighted it. My first day flying into Beijing on a cold, wintry day, and it was smoggy and cold, and I was utterly alone and no one to greet me. And hop on a car, visit a friend that I had there, and the next day I'm just on the street trying to figure, okay, first step, what do I do? I need a business license, but to get a business license, I have to already have a retail store for a retail license, and I can't get a store without a license. Vice versa, you can't open a store without the license, and you can't get the license without the store. And so we had this chicken and egg problem. I had to figure out what we're going to do, and I literally went and worked with a lawyer who was kind of helping us figure some things out. I walked into a sewing machine repair shop. It's about as big as the office I'm sitting in here, enough for like imagine a half the size of a one bedroom hotel room, or like a one bed hotel room. So a very, very small space. And I kind of tried to negotiate with the shop owner to see maybe he'd be interested to sell his sewing machine repair shop, because the lawyer had said anything with the computer chip inside of it, you should be able to convert as long as they sell something. And so I ended up coming back with a different lawyer. We ended up, the origin of Apple's currently, $70 billion business in China was basically a 50 square foot sewing machine repair shop that was dirty and dusty in the middle of Beijing. Like that's the origin and the history of where Apple Retail started their business in China.
So fast forward a little bit, so to kind of go through how, kind of quickly, how does distribution and sales and service become an actual vulnerability to Apple? I mean, the number you just named is huge. It's a giant part of Apple's sales revenue, but it is really a liability, and it's the part that Xi Jinping seems most able to attack. So I'll let
Yep.
either of you tackle that.
I just want to hear John. Go, John.
Well, I'll cover a little bit on the distribution, and you can cover the rest on the Xi's rise after
Sure.
the 2013 kind of his ascension. But prior to 2013, when the iPhone launched, it launched to some fanfare, but the first version didn't have Wi-Fi on it. It was 3G only. It wasn't until the next version came out, the iPhone 4S, that we had Wi-Fi in the phone, that it just took off. And we had this. There's a group of people called Huangnios. They're resellers. They look for inefficiency in any kind of supply chain around China, and they capitalize on it. So they try to buy up supply chain. They'll do it with railroad tickets. They do it with DMV appointments. If you can book an appointment somewhere, there's probably someone out there trying to capitalize off of that. And so they basically were able to book up every single iPhone that we sold. We had 4 stores at the time, and they were able to basically secure all the supply of it. And if you wanted to buy an iPhone in Beijing at the time, you'd have to walk up to the store. You'd see a reseller out front holding a phone. You couldn't buy the phone from me. You'd have to go buy it from him, because we couldn't control the crowds of people that they were bringing in to buy the phones. We had famously several riots. Had one of the riots led to me being thrown in jail for several days. And so that's the journey of China. But I remember telling my employees, the issue isn't the Huangneo. It isn't the fact that they're taking advantage of the fact that we don't have enough phones or enough distribution, but distribution is the challenge. If we had distribution across China, they wouldn't have an opportunity to capitalize on it. And Apple made a lot of people very, very rich in the process of actually, not managing distribution well at the beginning.
Yeah, so if I'm to jump in, I would say, so Apple trying to take control of these yellow cows is the term that I use in the book for these scalpers. They're being scammed essentially. So not only are the yellow cows doing everything that John just said, but they're also sometimes taking the phone apart, hollowing it out, inserting lookalike components, and then making money on the sale of those components, and then either selling that phone on or taking it back to the Apple store. And so they end up becoming greedy, and they go to places like Hong Kong or Portland, where you have an Apple store, but there's no sales tax. And so if you're bringing it into China, which does have a 20% sales tax, you're decreasing the cost of the item and then still selling it at an inflated price. And then beyond that, they end up, and some of this is after John's time, but they end up zapping. Well, no, let me sort of back up. They end up going to the United States, right? Purchasing phones with a fake ID, where with a 24-month contract, you can acquire a phone using just 1 month of the payment, right? They're never going to pay the other 23 months. And then they smuggle them into China in all sorts of partly ingenious, partly loony ways. And then they realize that the problem with those phones is they actually don't work in China. You can't just sort of purchase a phone under a Verizon contract and have it work in Beijing. So they zap the processor using factory connections that they have, which breaks the phone. But in the process, it masks where the phone was purchased, because any sort of data saying Verizon was on the CPU. And so they burn that out. And then they go to the Genius store and they say, hey, I'm just a regular guy. My phone isn't working and I don't know why, but it's brand new. And the Genius bar is looking at this phone and frankly can confirm that it's an unused phone and there must be a supply chain issue because the processor has been zapped. And so here's a brand new phone, right? And so instead of the lineup being sort of snaking around where you have 5,000 migrants all sort of at one entrance trying to get a new phone, which is sort of the earlier scheme, the line has sort of gone to the other side of the store where they're all at the Genius bar. I mean, I talked to some very senior people who remember sort of young students coming in with a backpack full of broken iPhones, basically saying, yeah, these are all my phones for my whole family or whatever, and none of them work and I don't know why. And then so Apple's replacing each and every phone, not realizing that they're being scammed. And then as they sort of catch on to it, they end up sort of tweaking the warranty policy to sort of take control of this scam. And that's what the yellow cows latch onto, that, hey, wait a minute, the Chinese consumer is being treated in an inferior way to the rest of the world because Chinese warranties are different from American or Canadian or European warranties. And so within 36 hours of Xi Jinping ascending to power, there's something every year in China called Consumer Day. And usually it's local companies that are called out essentially for not living up to the socialist values of the nation. There's nothing necessarily nefarious about it, but more and more Western companies come under attack in the 2010s. And in 2013, and this is the prologue of the book, it's Apple. And Apple is totally flummoxed by this narrative. I mean, you've got people on the media team all in a hotel room watching this live, strategizing as to what their problem is and what's going on. And they really can't make heads or tails of it because they're not aware of the warranty change. And even if they are aware of the actual change, they don't know why it's happened because not that many people are aware of how Apple's being scammed. And so this is really what leads to Apple, for the first time, having senior people at the vice president level living in the country, being the eyes and ears of Cupertino, because they recognize that we don't understand Chinese culture. We don't understand the political system. We're the most successful foreign brand operating in China, and we're the most successful retail giant in China. And yet, fundamentally, we don't understand this country. And that's sort of the origins story of their political awakening. And that sort of leads you through the rest of the book. You're on mute, Professor.
Thank you. Oops. Thanks. So just in the interest of time, I just want to hit on a couple more vulnerabilities. So we've got the vulnerabilities of really created by Xi Jinping coming on. By now, the supply chain has shifted somewhat to what you call the red supply chain, with more and more of the suppliers in China itself. Production is entirely concentrated in China. And there's one more vulnerability I'd like to point out, and that's their relationship and reliance on TSMC. They say that they're putting all their eggs in the TSMC basket, which will be fine as long as they guard all the eggs. But I think that seems really naive. How are they going to guard the eggs if China reclaims Taiwan?
Yeah, it's funny that the two of the three most valuable companies in the world are Nvidia and Apple, and among the things they share in common is that 100% of their chips are produced in Taiwan by TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. If anyone's not familiar with TSMC, I mean, a line that I steal from Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times is that it is the first company in the history of the world where, were it to stop producing tomorrow, the result would be a global recession, right? I mean, that is not even true of Apple. They produce something like 80 to 90% of all advanced chips in the world. And chips basically run the modern world. I mean, nothing can be made without chips. Something as basic as your dishwasher or microwave has chips in it. So they can't really be underestimated in terms of how important they are. And Apple has been their biggest client since around 2011. And indeed, in the same way that I talk about how Apple trained up hundreds of Chinese suppliers, Apple played a similar role for TSMC. In other words, yes, TSMC has all kinds of their own PhDs and real experts, but the demands that Apple would make in terms of how sophisticated, everything from like heat distribution and low power to just like everything about the circuitry. I mean, the things that Apple's own PhDs would be demanding of TSMC were extraordinary, and they would be investing tens of billions of dollars per year just in TSMC to meet those criteria and to do it at incredible volumes, right? I mean, just imagine. There's about 220 million iPhones sold per year. And then there are all their other products from AirTags to AirPods and computers. And TSMC chips are in all of them. So you've got a client there who's getting multiple chips per device for about 500 million devices. And something like the iPhone, if you don't know anything about chips, you would probably assume that something like an F-16 fighter jet probably has the most powerful chips in the world. Nope, the iPhone does. It's pretty incredible. And the other thing I would say about chips is that although they're about the size of your finger, they are basically skyscrapers at a microscopic level. They go down multiple levels and they're just amazingly complex. So if you need a quick primer on this, I would say read Chip War by Chris Miller. Chris ended up being something of a mentor to the book. My own book's 70-page outline was very much based on the outline that he submitted to me that he used for Chip War. So an incredible book. And yeah, look, I mean, Apple's dependence on China is the focus of my book, and yet their dependence on TSMC and Taiwan is probably even more stark. I don't know what you can do to mitigate that, other than there's been political pressure for the last 7 or 8 years for TSMC to build fabs, a fab being the term for a chip foundry, right, a chip manufacturer, in places like Arizona. I think Germany is the other place. And so this was Biden's flagship act called the CHIPS Act. And it authorized Congress to spend $52 billion over 4 years to bring more chip fabrication back to America. So there are some things happening there, but I wouldn't want to sort of overstate what's happening. the sort of industrial clusters around TSMC in Taiwan are world leading, ridiculously difficult to replicate, and ridiculously costly to replicate. So it's not that long ago that Apple PCs were all had Intel chips in them, which meant their exposure was to the United States, Israel, and a few other places. The move to TSMC for their whole computer lineup rather than just their phones was strategically brilliant in a certain sense. It's all designed by Apple, so Apple internally calls it Apple Silicon, but it really doubled down their exposure, not to China per se, but to the China-Taiwan area. Because I'm probably not making any news here, but Taiwan, in China's eyes, is a rogue province that should be reabsorbed at some point. And so the sort of threat that Beijing goes after Taiwan or tries to annex them at some point, I compare it to a meteor strike on Apple's business. Because if there were a war, the first thing to stop working would be the fabs. And if you don't have fabs, you don't have any Apple products this year.
Well, that's kind of frightening. So I do want to leave a little time for questions, but since I teach about supply chains, I think there's this tendency to think it's not that big of a deal to just move your supply chain to India or wherever, or Vietnam. But China has sunk billions into Apple's supply chain and doesn't want them to leave. Apple suppliers have sunk billions into Apple's supply chain, and Apple has sunk billions and billions. I mean, Biden's CHIPS Act pales in comparison to what Apple has invested in China.
Yep.
And so the idea of just up and moving that just seems unrealistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's at least 20 reasons why iPhones are never be built at any sort of scale in America. And just in case this is kind of helpful, sometimes what happens is Donald Trump or someone will ask Tim Cook to open a factory in America. And you have to understand that that's basically a nonsensical request. I mean, for starters, there are no Apple factories. They don't even have Apple factories in China. So what's Tim Cook going to open, right? At best, he could convince someone like Foxconn to open a factory. But Foxconn has to do so for its own business reasons, which is to say, Apple's not their only client. And to work efficiently, going back to that spiky production I talked about, Foxconn workers need something to do when it's not peak iPhone season. So to be an effective Foxconn factory, you need dozens of clients so that your workers have something to do year round. And frankly, that you're taking the Apple skills and then you're applying them to other places. And then to be efficient, you don't want to be relying on a bunch of stuff coming from overseas. So you would want to replicate China's model of next door manufacturing, where, beside the assembler is the plastic injection molding plant. And beside that is the metal stamping plant, and going on and on. And in addition to that, you don't just want one of those plants. You want 2 or 3, maybe even 4 or 5 of them, because Apple really relies on the competition between each of those vendors to basically drive up quality and drive down cost. So it's not a matter of just opening a factory that assembles iPhones. You need the whole thing, right? And then you're just talking about literal hundreds of billions of dollars. And even Apple really doesn't have the wherewithal to cause that to happen. And each of those actors, in their own sort of rational way, needs to come to think that Arizona or whatever is the place to go build this stuff. And so it's a huge ask, and it's something that would take 10 to 20 years to even accomplish, if it could be accomplished at all. And it really is a big if. Far more likely is India. And I say that just because India has 1.5 billion people. It's actually more populous than China. It has labor rates comparable to what China had 20, 25 years ago. But even there, I'm not all that optimistic, because the similarities between India and China are superficial. The differences between the two countries, the two cultures, are profound. And it wouldn't just be a copy and paste model of what has worked in China. Let's go apply that in India. Quite frankly, I do think that's what Apple is trying. And I think they've been failing so far, and they'll continue to fail. So India is the best hope of a sort of decoupling from China strategy on the world stage. And yet I think China's world leading machinery and processes and just the whole sort of topography of how things get made there is just so unsurpassable that I really think Apple is captured, which is where the title of the book comes from. So just one statistic on that I would point out is that China installed more industrial robots on its production lines last year than the rest of the world combined. So if you're reading the headlines, you probably have a sense that, oh, actually, India is slowly catching up year in, year out. The gap is getting closer and closer between the two. I think the gap is getting wider and wider, and you're just going to have a more pronounced superiority of Chinese manufacturing year in, year out, unless something absolutely dramatic changes. And I don't think tariffs are the answer for that. I don't see anything dramatic changing that respect at all.
Great. So at this point, we have 10 or 15 minutes left, and I just wanted to open it up to any student questions. And of course, I have tons more questions, as I always do, but I did want to make the opportunity available for students or anybody else to ask a question. So if you have a question, if you're Victoria, you can unmute and ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much for this lecture. I would like to ask if since Apple is moving into other service, I want to ask if you do think that the company is trying to be a business model that reduce this dependency on the iPhone over the next decade?
Yeah, I think there's sort of two answers to give. And John, if you have your own answers, by all means, I would love to hear from you. So I would say, for starters, it's more the opportunity that Apple realized, hey, we have 1.5 billion people staring at our glowing rectangle 4 hours a day. This is probably a pretty big opportunity to advertise to them, to get them to subscribe to certain things, to purchase various things. And it's just like a massive driver of profits, because the margins on that business, what Apple calls the services business, are north of 70%, right? So every $100 you spend on services within your iPhone, Apple's getting 70 of those dollars. I mean, that's just absolutely extraordinary. So even something as basic as when you're in the Safari browser and you just use the browser, the URL space itself, to type into something, without maybe your knowledge, you're using Google. And Google is paying Apple $20 billion just for the privilege of Google being the default there. So Apple basically recognizes in the 2010s just what it means to have that sort of leverage and power. And they're exploiting it to its full potential. The other thing I would say that I think gets missed is that this is non-manufacturing and therefore non-China revenue. So as much as the media has sort of hyped up Apple's ability to sort of de-risk from China by having manufacturing move to India, it's actually totally dwarfed by the services narrative, because me and millions of other people, subscribing to iCloud accounts or something, that is far more diversification to their balance sheet than anything they're doing in India. John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, for me, if you go back to the early days when Steve got there, he was pretty clear. Like we're going to do the things we think we can add value in. And Apple's a huge company, and they've expanded a lot. But you'll notice they don't buy a lot of companies. They don't expand into spaces that are kind of considered up and coming. They're really not heavy on AI. They probably missed a boat there a little bit, trying to play catch up. But you don't see them investing heavy to really try to cover everything to put everyone else out of business. And so they're pretty conservative when you look at how they run the business. As the world's largest company, you think they could take the cash hoard they've got and go out and acquire and move into new areas of different types of industries. And the automobile space is one they've been talking about for quite a long time. And so I think that when you think about how Apple is going to continue to expand and grow in the next 10 to 20 years, think about the fact that they've got an ethos inside the company that they only want to do things that they think they can add value to, and they're never worried about being first to anything.
Brennan.
Thank you. So we heard you talk about how Apple received this political criticism in 2013, and then Apple had this realization that they fundamentally do not understand Chinese culture and politics. What was their strategy going forward to kind of change the optics of Apple in China and change, how they comply with regulation and just the political vision within China?
So this is like 4 or 5 chapters, but I'll just try to distill it to like 1 minute. Essentially, Apple gets called out for not having any joint ventures. So joint ventures is really what Beijing had been asking for since the early 1980s, which is to say that if me and John go to China to set up a business, the other half of the company should be Chinese. And as John and I sort of come up with our products, the idea is that the Chinese part of the business sort of learns the tricks of the trade and then can sort of take those skills and thrive on their own. I hope that's a fair summation of what a JV is supposed to be. Apple didn't have any JVs, and in a sense, it's that Beijing didn't even know what they were doing. Again, they were operating under the radar. They were flying so many people from San Francisco over to factories in China that they literally had United fly to places one way, or sorry, not one way, round trip. Without stop, nonstop is what I'm trying to say, 3 times a week to places like Chengdu, to places like Hangzhou, with the understanding that Apple would buy so many of the first class seats that even if the rest of the plane were empty, they would still make money. And so they were just sort of operating with this model where things were being orchestrated from afar. So there wasn't sort of some entity where half of it would be Chinese. And Apple had to sort of turn the tables on this narrative and sort of point out that, look, it's true, Samsung has 3 dozen JVs operating in China and we have 0, but you don't understand. We're working more intimately with hundreds of factories around the country in ways that Samsung never does, because the likes of Samsung are basically hoping that their suppliers come up with, lighter materials, more durable materials or whatever, and then incorporate them into the next phone. Apple is only playing in the high end. I mean, it's easier to think of like Samsung being the equivalent of like a Volkswagen, and Apple being something more like a Porsche, if not a Ferrari. There's a lot more complex processes and proprietary processes that are taking place. And what Apple's able to explain to the highest echelons of the Communist Party is your suppliers don't know how to do what we're going to do next year. And the way that they're going to get there is we're going to train the hell out of them. And so then they can take their skills and they can say to Huawei, to Oppo, to Vivo, to Xiaomi, hey, guess what? We know how to do this, right?
Oops. I think
Patrick froze up.
Patrick just froze. Uh-oh. Hopefully he'll
I'm back. I
come
don't know what
back.
happened.
Oh, there. Are you back?
Am I back?
Yes, you're back.
Yeah, okay. So I hope it went out when I thought it went out. So the result of that is that those 4 Chinese companies in particular become world leading because they're all relying on the supply chain that Apple trained, invested in, taught, and even often gave the machinery to. And so I think the figures within China are that the local share, i.e. Chinese smartphone market share within China, is I think 10% in 2010, 2011. And within 5 or 6 years, it's 75%. So they're able to basically tell the higher echelons of the CCP, we are the biggest contributor of what you call indigenous innovation in the country.
Yeah, and that really came, as you look at 2013 beyond the Gang of 8 piece, I left China and the Gang of 8 comes in, and this is right about the time that Apple started realizing they needed to work harder at figuring out the way that the Chinese government works. I think in 2011, 2012, I was the one kind of screaming into the wind that, you guys don't quite get what's going on here. And every time I would call for these riots and things that were happening, the first response was always call the police. And I'm like, you guys don't understand China at all. The depth of the company generally didn't have many people that understood the challenges that we were living day to day. And so even as an executive in the company trying to get people to pay attention, it really didn't kick off until 2013 that they realized it wasn't just me, saying this. There was really, truly a problem.
Yeah. Luda, what's your question there?
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned that suppliers working with Apple would gain value not really from money, but from learning. That's, I think, what I got.
Yeah.
So this led me to think if the primary motivation is experience and learning rather than profit, this may imply that Apple is collaborating with less experience or less skilled workers. So my question was, at what point do Apple suppliers move beyond working with the company primarily for learning, but transition to other firms? And does this imply that Apple frequently changes suppliers as a result? Because as soon as they have gained sufficient knowledge, they may choose to move on to other firms.
So
for
it's kind of
developers.
happening concurrently, but often what will happen is Apple will co-invent, and it's worth really emphasizing co-invention, right? What Apple finds is competent suppliers that are sort of trainable and will absorb like sponges. Um, but it's not just that Apple knows all the answers to how to, actually manufacture something that's come out of the mind of Johnny Ive and industrial design. Apple has to go co-invent that with the suppliers. So the suppliers play a monumental role actually coming up with these processes, right? But Apple has such leverage in the negotiations that the IP behind it is supposed to be Apple's. I say supposed to be because legally it can be quite difficult to enforce in China. So sometimes what happens is the supplier is not supposed to offer what Apple has taught them for some duration, but it usually isn't more than a year. So in that sense, especially in the mid 2010s, Apple has the sense that, okay, sure, everybody's copying what we're doing, and they're doing it with our very own suppliers. Because, of course, Apple doesn't own these suppliers. They're partnerships, and the companies are free to operate with other companies as well. But as long as they're copying what we've shipped rather than what we are about to ship, they will always be one step behind. That's a pretty clever strategy until you realize that there's sort of only so many things you can do before the iPhone is kind of a perfected product, and what you're changing is just like the battery life and the cameras and stuff each year. And so I think between 2014, the Chinese go from just mimicry of the iPhone to really like matching them in quality by 2018, and then arguably today to surpassing them in quality, where I think Huawei has features that iPhone doesn't have, didn't have last week, and isn't expected to have next year. I'm in particular thinking of the Huawei Mate XT, which in Apple terms is an iPhone and an iPad in one. It unfolds twice. When it's unfolded, it is thinner than the iPad Pro, which Apple bills as its thinnest product ever. So, China is not just some cheap imitator that is doing the low value functions these days. It has their own Johnny Ives. It's doing everything from ID to product design to manufacturing design to all the operations, distribution, logistics, etc. And they're no longer the cheap imitation company. That Huawei phone I mentioned cost $2,600. So that's a pretty strange thing, that you've got more luxurious products coming out of these companies. And some of the best narrative, if I can say that, of my own book, is the chapter that's actually wholly based on court documents that I was able to get. So it's depositions of Tim Cook about the problems in China. It's emails from Tim Cook to the board of directors. It's internal studies of Huawei as a competitive threat, labeled highly confidential, rather than basing it on interviews within people that were making the decisions. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages of internal documents that I was able to receive and tell the narrative through that. So sorry, I could give a longer answer. That was probably already too long, so I'll let there be another question.
That was a great answer. So Domenico, you get the last question, and then we'll wrap up.
So yes, first of all, thank you for the lecture, and second, I wanted to ask why Apple, like what inspired you to write about Apple and not, I don't know, Samsung or other companies? And I have a question for John Ford too. How difficult was for you when you started going to China, the transition, even the lifestyle, and how difficult was for you to explain to the executive at the time how to behave, because clearly you had less experience than them, but they had to rely on you, and how difficult was the relationship between you and them?
Yeah.
Why don't I start with just a very quick and boring answer, which is to say, well, I was the Apple reporter, not the Samsung reporter for the Financial Times. So in a certain sense, I just wasn't thinking about other companies. But I don't want to make it sound too arbitrary. I mean, Apple is the most, or at least it was at the publication of my book, the world's most valuable company, and had clearly contributed more to China's development than anybody else. And if that sounds like an outlandish statement, I would just say, find me another company with $400 billion of revenue, 80% of it is hardware, and 90% of the hardware is made in China. You won't find any because there's nothing like that. And so Apple's influence on China was just on a different level than anybody else. I probably don't have to say anything more than that. So that's it for me. I won't go, but I would love to hear John's answer.
Yeah, you're certainly a fan of the company. I see your Think Different posters frequently. So he is more than just a reporter. I think he's an avid fan. Yeah. So for me, I think the transition global. I've lived in 5 countries in my life. I've lived a quarter of my life in Asia. I've moved, I think, 17 times now at various points in my life. So changing locations is not new to me. So personal adaptation for me is pretty easy. I tell most people that come to China, all of my employees that would transfer, the first year, it's just for first 6 to 8 months, it's like a vacation for the first part. Then you get homesick for 3 or 4 months, and right about the 1 year mark, it starts to feel like home. And that's when you know you can last. If you can last a year in any foreign country, you're probably going to be there as long as you want to be. From a company perspective, I think people didn't quite understand what I was trying to accomplish. Like, I think my first group of managers, I took them, brought them from China to America to kind of indulge them into a culture, and I took them to Disneyland. And all I wanted them to see, and I got in a lot of trouble from people saying, "You're taking them on vacation." I said, "No, we're going to go see the most cultured business in the world. Disneyland calls itself the happiest place on earth and has for 50 years. Let's go find out why." And we started with the ticket booth. So watch the ticket taker, how excited they are to take your money, give you a badge, your first time going to the park. They're just excited. I said, where's the person that sits behind them with a knife in their back, making them smile like that? And so that culture piece, I think I understood better than a lot of the executives who didn't work at the level that I did. And so for me, going to China was, I think, an experiment for them. Luckily, it was small enough. They let me go do what I wanted. About 3 to 4 years in, people realized it was suddenly becoming a multi-billion-dollar business, and that's kind of when things started to kind of go sideways. I had a lot of respect from people that knew me well, knew the business that I ran. There were a handful of executives that would kind of argue, and this was how Apple worked back in the day. It wasn't very hierarchical, other than Steve. Steve would give orders, and we would all go do things. The rest of us would just get in a room and talk and try to come up with good solutions. We had a lot of really good people working at Apple. It's one thing I tell people that the difference of Apple and other companies I've worked at Microsoft, I work at Samsung right now, actually. There is a difference in how every company operates. At Apple, it was, let's go find the solution. Let's get in a room, hash it out, figure out the right thing to do. So culturally, Apple was really well poised to take advantage of some of the growth that they got into. For me personally in China, the adaptation for the culture of the company, that part I think was easier for me than for many people that have done it.
Okay. Unfortunately, we have to cut the discussion off here. But what I would encourage, especially students on the call, if you're interested in continuing to discuss Patrick's book and to talk about Apple in China, then I would encourage you to meet with the China Affairs Forum at GW, which is a student-led organization. And this book is going to be the topic for the next month or so of discussions. They meet once a week, and there's a link to their information in the chat. So if you're interested in that, please take a look at the link in the chat. And otherwise, I just can't thank you, Patrick and John. What a treat to have you join us. And it's really been wonderful and educational. And, I wish you all the best with your book tour. Look forward to the next book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to have you all here. And thank in particular to John and Professor.
Thank you.